Welcome to Peter Dinesen's professorial inaugural lecture. I'm Ben Lauderdale. I'm the head of Department of Political Science. Professorial inaugural lectures are an opportunity to celebrate the research and careers of colleagues who have been newly promoted to or hired as UCL professors. Owing to a combination of departmental growth, the successful career advancement of many of our colleagues in a two-year pandemic, this lecture is one of 9 of these lectures that we're holding this year. And I think we're really excited to be able to reconvene and hear a lot about the outstanding work of our colleagues, old and new. We have terrific work to catch up on. Peter Dinesen completed his PhD at Aarhus University in Denmark in 2011 and swiftly progressed from assistant to associate to full professor at the University of Copenhagen over the following years. In this time, he's developed a multi-threaded research agenda in political behavior, political psychology, public opinion, and mental health. This research has touched on social trust, immigration, and intergroup attitudes, which he will discuss today, as well as a range of related topics relevant to domestic politics in developed democracies. This work has been published in a variety of the top journals in political science, as well as in the journals of other fields, such as epidemiology. This variety of publication venues reflects the interdisciplinary nature of much of his research, examining the interactions of social geography and context, social background and individual characteristics, health, and politics. There's a tendency for social sciences to sort by dependent variable. Political scientists often view economics and health as sort of mere independent variables, as potential explanations for the variation in political outcomes that we really care about. Economists, in turn, might worry about political and health shocks to the economic outcomes and behaviors that are their core concern. And epidemiologists might focus on the effects of economics and politics on health outcomes. It's to Peter's credit that he has not let the classification of dependent variables into disciplines distort his research interests, which very clearly lie at the intersection of these. To the extent that there are indeed messy and multi-directional causal relationships that exist between economics, health, and politics, it's important to have scholars who are engaged with all of these. Since these relationships are all potential confounders and sources of endogeneity for one another when it comes to doing empirical research, this kind of interdisciplinary orientation is vital for generating robust analysis at the intersection of different fields. In addition to covering a variety of different fields, Peter's research employs a wide range of data sources. These include survey data, geographic data, data from public registries. His research has included research carefully ruling out possible explanations in observational data, as well as experimental designs. Danish registry data is well known across a number of fields for providing data that's simply impossible to get in most countries, including data about individual incomes and health that can be linked to other measurements for those individuals. Peter is, of course, not the only researcher to have used such data, but he has creatively leveraged them to look at very local features of economic circumstances and how they relate to political behavior. I will admit that those of us outside of Denmark and the very few other countries with data like this occasionally have unseemly flashes of jealousy about these data sources. I have heard, I would never say this myself, but I have heard research using registry data referred to as doing social science on easy mode. This is, I think, a bit unfair because as with any data source, one quickly exhausts the easy questions that you're enabled to answer by these data, and you move on to the much more difficult questions that such data make tractable when they would otherwise be impossible. Peter's work very clearly is in this latter category. I think that what's remarkable about Peter's work is that despite the wide range of fields, topics, and methods that he engages with, and the large number of papers he has published in the mere 11 years since his PhD, there's a very clear intellectual thread running through his work. So much of the politics of the last decade clearly sits at the intersection of economic change, immigration, social trust, and well-being, and this is what his research explores. This is true in Denmark. It's also true in the UK, it's also true in the US, and it's true in many other developed countries. These are pressing questions about the direction of politics, as well as about health and economics, and they're ones that Peter has been attempting to answer throughout his career thus far. So I look forward to hearing in a moment about how he puts some of this work together today. So before I hand off to Peter, I want to remind you that there is a drinks reception after the lecture in 36 Gordon Square. And with that, This is Peter Dinesen's inaugural lecture entitled Diverse and Disunited, The Consequences of Immigration for Social Trust in Western Societies.
Thank you very much, Ben. This is a very, very kind, almost too kind introduction. I really appreciate it. Also, thank you, Alan, for facilitating this inaugural lecture and helping out with that. I really appreciate it. And Nils, thank you for agreeing to moderate the Q&A that we will have after my presentation. So, feel free to think about tough questions. Not too tough, but tough questions during my presentation that you can ask afterwards. Okay, so what I will be doing now, I will give you a broad stroke overview of some of the research I've been doing over the past 15 years or so. I will basically give you a rough outline of a book I'm currently writing together with my longtime co-author, Kim Sønderskov from Aarhus University. And yeah, it's basically studying the consequences, or the potential consequences of immigration for social trust in Western societies. And lastly, I should say thank you all very much for being here on a Tuesday night. I'm sure you had many other better things to do, so I really appreciate that as well. Thank you. Right, so what I will be doing, I will first of all explain to you, hopefully convince you, that generalized social trust is an important trait in society, or that it helps facilitate a better functioning society. I'll also explain how I understand generalized social trust and how I think we should understand it, and sort of to pinpoint its importance. Then I will go into the actually quite elaborate debate in the field about how can we meaningfully measure something that as complex as trust in a useful way. And lastly, I will sort of get to the meat of it and talk about whether social trust is actually threatened by immigration. Okay, so to start us off, what is generalized social trust? Why does it matter? So the way I think about generalized social trust is as a belief about, or a perception of, trustworthiness of unknown others. So in strangers or in people that we basically don't have any information about. So one could probably think about that as a sort of a standard estimate of the likelihood of other people being trustworthy in general, absence of any other information about them. It's important to stress that this form of trust is not in out or in-group members. So I'm not talking about, let's say, native British individuals' trust in immigrants or vice versa. I'm specifically talking about trust more generally, or trust in sort of in the abstract others, or in strangers, if you will. One reason why this generalized social trust is important is that it influences the decisions that we make, how we behave in situations with other individuals that involve risk, where we could potentially be deceived or cheated in various ways to our disadvantage. When we are engaging in such interactions, making decisions as to whether we should trust someone in an interaction like that under uncertainty, we try to gather as much information as possible in order to sort of make the right decision, so to speak. But very often, the information available at hand is incomplete, meaning that we can actually not sort of be very certain about this. So in situations like that, which are the vast majority in a modern large-scale society, such as the British one, we have to, at least to some extent, rely on our generalized social trust, so our sort of general perception about other people, that we then use to sort of make decisions or inferences about whether other people are likely to cooperate with us or not in those situations. It also implies that to the extent that there's less information available, we will have to rely more on our generalized social trust. So because a lot of interactions that take place are between essentially strangers, or people that are almost strangers to each other, generalized social trust is a very important feature or trait that influences how we interact with other people. And it will predispose us to behave in a more cooperative and trustworthy way towards other people. So from that, it also basically follows that trust furthers cooperation. And this flows from the widely established idea that humans are what is being referred to as conditional cooperators. So we have an instinct for altruism or tit for tat, meaning that we would like to cooperate but only if we expect others to do the same, or trust them to do the same, to sort of highlight the relevance of trust in this case. So I might be willing to pay my taxes. I might be willing to get a vaccine against the COVID pandemic or the COVID epidemic. I might be willing to engage in recycling, et cetera, if I think that other people are doing the same thing. So put in a more simple way, I'm basically willing to be a good citizen if I trust that you will be the same. I don't want to be the only one doing it, because if I'm the only one paying my taxes, it makes no difference. But if other people are doing the same, or I trust them to do the same, then I'm actually also, on average, more willing to do so myself. So that's why trust is important for how we function as a society more broadly. So it basically furthers cooperation. And because, to the extent that we can trust other people to actually, act in a cooperative way, or that we trust them to do so, and therefore cooperate ourselves, that reduces or lowers the cost of monitoring interactions between people and sanctioning people who don't live up to these standards, and that frees up resources that can be spent in more productive ways for better government and for more well-functioning societies more broadly. There are also individual benefits to trust, which I think are somehow overlooked, or to some extent overlooked in the social sciences. So of course it might be the case that I could sort of buy something cheaper from someone if we trust each other and we don't need a third party to monitor our transaction. So that might be one sort of financial, economic benefit. But I think in some ways the most important benefit is actually that trust enables or facilitates our formation of social ties with other people. So it's hard to imagine a friendship developing without us having some initial level of trust leading us to sort of reaching out to that person, and then from there developing a more intimate relationship. It's also, I think, fair to stress that social trust is associated with a number of other desirable features, such as subjective well-being and good health. In this case, I would say we don't really have any clear evidence on the causality of the relationship. It just seems like social trust is basically part of sort of what we can call well-being, the phenomenon of well-being more broadly. So hopefully having given you an idea about how I think about generalized social trust and why I think it's important to understand and to study and to understand whether it's threatened by immigration and other developments, I'll move on to talk about how we could potentially measure trust. So there's basically two ways of doing that. One is behavioral experiments, which I think is a valid way of measuring trust. There is, however, a limitation in how many people you can survey and how many contexts. So we are relying in this project on a very widely used survey question, which asks the following: generally speaking, would you say that most people can be trusted, or that you cannot be too careful in dealing with others? In this version, there's different versions of it, but in this version, you basically have two response options. You could either indicate most people can be trusted, or that you cannot be too careful. Obviously, with the former being the trustful response, and the latter being the distrustful response, the mistrustful response. So I would say reasonably, given how extremely widely used this survey measure has been, it's also received quite a bit of criticism. Two criticisms that I find the most important ones are A, on the one hand, that people criticize it for being non-specific. So, what are you actually talking about? What is the specific trust situation you have in mind? And secondly, it's unclear what most people refer to. So in many ways, at least the second criticism is a very generic criticism of survey questions, but nevertheless, it is of course a fair sort of criticism to voice against the measure. Regarding the first criticism, I would say, well, for me, that's sort of the point. I want to have a measure that is essentially, not situation specific, but more generalized. At least that's what I intend to measure with the survey measure of trust that I'm using. As to the second one, I conducted, together with Kim, an experiment where we tried to sort of show that while there might be some truth to this point, and part of the criticism is basically that people saying, well, what if people are thinking about their neighbors, or they're thinking about their friends instead of other people in general, as I have in mind when I talk about this? Then people might have different frames of reference, and the trust measure we end up with is basically measuring something different for different people. I think, again, that's a fair point. But one way of trying to address this is to take the original question in a survey, give that to half of the respondent, randomly chosen, And then to the other half of the respondents, we basically gave them the same question, but where we also additionally specified that we are specifically interested in unknown others. So basically something that comes closer to the concept of trust, as I described it earlier. So what we find using those two different versions of the question, like the newer and more valid one compared to the classical one, is that using the newer, more valid one that sort of rules out that this could be just about neighbors or friends, we do find lower levels of trust, indicating there might be something to that criticism. But more importantly for our project, and probably also more generally, we do find that when we do a retest in a couple of weeks after, we basically find that the new question is very strongly predictive of the original question, like how people respond to that 2 weeks after, essentially, and vice versa, indicating that, okay, it might be that the classical measure exaggerates trust, but it meaningfully indexes the variations in trust between individuals, and those are the ones that we're interested in this case. It might even be the case that this is actually not a problem, it just sort of pushes the level of trust up across sort of societies, but when we're looking at the differences, it doesn't really sort of have any implications for that. So with that, we argue that it is a reasonably valid measure, not a perfect one for certain, but again, especially perhaps given the fact that it has, I think it's been used for almost 80 years, it is actually something, it does measure something reasonably valid when it comes to measuring generalized social trust as we understand it. All right, now let me get to the substance, or the substantive side of things, immigration and trust. And maybe you have sort of heard about this debate, but continued immigration into Western countries has raised the question whether this has consequences for, more broadly, social cohesion in this society, and more specifically also whether it's a threat to trust, sort of as this cooperative disposition that I talked about in the countries receiving immigrants. So to sort of put it in stark terms, the question is basically whether can high levels of trust in other people be maintained in the face of an increasingly ethnically diverse population. So, before attempting to give like a partial answer to that, we could think about why might immigration potentially erode trust. And as I see it, I can think of at least two channels, probably also more, so they're not exhaustive in this regard. The first channel would be, for example, with immigrants migrating from, in general, low-trust societies to high-trust societies. Do immigrants, in this case, tend to preserve or stick to the low levels of trust, or bring the low level of trust from their country of origin, and then sort of keep that or maintain that when they migrate to the high-trust society? So that means that in that society, there could potentially be pockets of mistrust, especially with immigrants making up a larger share of the population. It could also be that when natives interact with immigrants who have lower levels of trust, it might rub off through their interactions, and they might also eventually sort of adopt mistrust in this case. So we can think of that as maybe as a sort of a compositional explanation in this regard. On the other hand, and this is probably the one, or it's definitely the one that has received the most interest in the literature and probably also in the public debate more broadly, it might be that the encounters that the native population, the native-born population has in the immigrant-receiving countries with immigrants who tend to have a different ethnic background, that they might occur in different social settings, where they live, where they work, etc., on the bus. Those interactions might lead to a drop in trust among the native-born population. So I'm going to try to examine or address both of these channels and see what is the available evidence when it comes to them. Before doing that, I just want to link this back to a very fundamental discussion in the trust literature. So there's basically, trust is usually being thought of as having one or two very generic and sort of wide sources or like basically to spring from two different sources. On the one hand, there's this perspective that trust is a cultural trait. So this is essentially a socialization story where trust is something that's being passed on from parents to their children in early life. And after that, there's basically very little change in trust. And that might even extend over generations, meaning that in the case of the first channel, that immigrants, from this perspective, will bring mistrust to their country of origin, and then would then sort of pass it on to their children, and that would sort of make low trust perpetuate in those populations, even over time. Regarding the second channel, this cultural approach basically says there shouldn't be any effect of being exposed to immigrants among the natives because their trust is already shaped. So whatever they encounter after maybe, let's say, they're around 20 or so, it doesn't really have any influence. In contrast to that cultural approach, which is quite dominant in the trust literature, there's what is referred to as the experiential approach. It stresses that trust is something that is maybe not sort of from day to day, but over time updated with the experiences that people have. And I can sort of hands down say that this is sort of the camp that I'm in. That basically means that trust is something that is shaped by the experiences we have. If they tend to be positive, we will adjust our trust upwards eventually, and downwards, of course, if they tend to be more negative. So going back to the channels I was talking about, this implies that if immigrants have positive experiences like the native population in the country they've migrated to, they would, perhaps especially over time, adopt the level of trust of natives in the new country, given that sort of the new experiential setting they are in. So the context they're then in would then sort of entail different experiences that would eventually, at least potentially, lead to a catch-up to the level of trust of natives living there. Regarding the second channel that I spoke about, the experiential perspective at least raises the possibility that there is some influence of being exposed or encountering immigrants or ethnic outgroups in different settings among the native population. It doesn't mean that it is necessarily this form of experience, but at least it opens up for that being a potential influence. Now let's have a look at the empirical evidence. So first, regarding the cultural persistence of mistrust, or put in a more popular way, does distrust travel? And I've done many analyses on this, and in many ways, this graph basically summarizes my findings, even though it's just a simple bivariate graph that we are planning on using in our book. But what it does, it breaks down social trust, measured, as I talked about before, with the standard question, and then it breaks it down for countries in the European Social Survey, and for 3 different groups: for the native-born, for first-generation immigrants, and for descendants of immigrants, or what is sometimes referred to as second-generation immigrants. And what you see here is, to me, a striking pattern of very, very close resemblance, in general at least, of immigrants and descendants of immigrants to that of the native-born population in the country they live in. So to exemplify, or put it in more substantive terms, in this, again, it's a bivariate analysis, but in this case, second-generation immigrants in Denmark are the second most trusting of all groups. They're even more trusting than native Norwegians in this, which, I mean, maybe that doesn't sort of tell you a lot, but to me, that's actually quite striking. Norwegians are pretty trusting, so, no, but the point I'm trying to make is that, it basically tells a very clear story. Especially in the higher trust countries, there's a very, very strong resemblance, or correlation, if you will, in the trust of immigrants and that of the native-born population. So that suggests that there is essentially this catch-up I was talking about, that there is not a strong sort of trust gap between immigrants and descendants of immigrants vis-a-vis the native-born population that they in the country that they've migrated to. So we've done a number of more sophisticated analyses. We don't have analyses. We don't have sort of perfect causal evidence in this regard. But we've tried doing sort of different things that can get at this to some extent. And this is an early attempt where I compared basically 3 groups. So trust among 3 groups, either having migrated to high trust countries in Northern Europe, or living in, to their compatriots living in their ancestral countries. So for example, I took Turks living in Northern Europe and compared them to Turks living in their home country. And then I matched them on a number of characteristics, their education, and a number of other sort of observational sort of covariates. And what we find out in this analysis is there's a very strong effect, if you will. Of course, that's disputable, but there's a very strong tendency for migrants who've migrated to have higher levels of trust than observationally similar people in their home country, essentially. So again, an indication that there is sort of this catch-up effect that migrants basically become trusting, more or less as trusting, as a matter of fact, as the native population in the country where they live. And to me, that's also, theoretically speaking, a strong indication that experiences in this context matter, and it's not that trust, as it's sometimes portrayed as being something extremely stable. No, it does actually change over time and with the experiences that people have. So to sum up for the first channel, we basically see weak cultural persistence. We see a strong experiential adaptation, very strong, I would say. So there's a very, to a very high extent, immigrants resemble the native-born population in the country they live in terms of the level of trust. This also implies that there's little support for the contention that immigration is eroding trust through immigrants bringing mistrust to their new countries, essentially. Of course, the obvious follow-up question is, why do immigrants become more trusting? I've done quite a bit of research on that. I don't have time to unfold it today, but basically what I find is that institutional fairness is key. And in some sense, that's interesting because that's this is a different discussion, but that's also essentially what I think is the main reason why some countries are very trusting to begin with. That's because they have high institutional fairness, they have low corruption. But that is also as I see it, the causal driver of why immigrants become more trusting when they migrate to a high trust society, because they encounter high institutional fairness. They experience low corruption, which is frequently also in sharp contrast to what they're used to where they come from. And that increases trust through at least two different channels. First of all, it reduces incentives to cheat. If you cannot take advantage of the system, you also know that other people cannot do it to your disadvantage, which in a sense incentivizes, or it reduces the incentive to try to abuse the system to your own advantage. It also signals fairness more broadly when you encounter representatives of the state, which are generally exhibiting these norms of fairness and trustworthiness. Okay, so having examined the first channel, looking at immigrants and what happens to their trust when they migrate to a high trust setting, let's go to the other side of the coin. Let's see whether natives are influenced by living in more ethnically diverse societies and encountering immigrants in various settings. So this has been a very extensive debate for quite a while, but especially since Robert Putnam published a very controversial result about 15 years ago from the United States, where he showed that in more ethnically diverse localities, trust is basically lower, both trust in in-groups and out-groups and generalized trust, so any form of trust essentially. And that really spurred on a large debate about whether ethnic diversity or immigration and the ethnic diversity that follows from that, whether that has negative consequences for social cohesion more broadly and more specifically for social trust. So what I'm trying to understand here is whether exposure to immigrants and or contact with immigrants, how that, the specific form of interaction you have with immigrants, whether that shapes natives' trust in other people in general. It's relatively poorly theorized in literature. There's tons of empirical studies, but not many of them are very well theorized, essentially. The way I see a potential influence working is that, from my experiential perspective, people, at least to some extent, base their beliefs about other people's trustworthiness on what they actually experience in their everyday lives. I mean, there's probably also quite strong personality dimension to it, for example, but at least part of how they arrive at an estimate of other people's trustworthiness is based on what they experience. If you couple that with the widely established human universal, more or less, that there's ethnocentrism, meaning that people are negatively disposed towards people that they perceive as being outgroup members, including if they're of different ethnic origin, then that leads to the potential inference that when you are exposed to a higher concentration of outgroup members, that will then lead you to infer that other people are, in general, slightly less trusting than if you were surrounded by people that are basically in-group members or that you perceive as being in-group members. I want to say in this case, it does not necessarily presuppose any form of direct competition between groups or any resulting threat following from that competition. It's possible that it's simply being around people that you perceive as being different, and then you more or less instinctively have sort of an aversion towards, maybe just a slight one, but just to emphasize, there doesn't need to be any competition. If there is competition, maybe the potential negative effect is magnified, but in theory, there doesn't need to be this sort of conflict in order for this to work. So if we zoom out and look at the relationship between the share of foreign-born, one indication of immigration, and the level of trust in 4 different societies, I've looked here at Denmark, which is the case I know the best, and then the UK, that I'm increasingly getting to know, and then, of course, also the United States and Canada. And as you could see, just eyeballing basically the relationship, I mean, the first thing that's really clear is that there's certainly not any sort of universal relationship in this regard. So looking at Canada, okay, there's been a slight increase in immigration, and trust has been more or less stable. In the UK, from around 1980 or so, there's basically been almost, trust has been stable, immigration has increased a bit. In the United States, we've seen famously a drop in trust, which has also coincided with immigration. But, I mean, as Robert Putnam has discussed, there's probably also a number of other potential explanations for this trend. And then lastly, in Denmark, we could easily be led to believe that actually immigration is positive for trust, because over the period of, from 1960, or at least from 1980, going onwards, there's basically been, of course, a quite marked increase in the level of trust, in immigration, and at the same time, trust has really increased very, very markedly in Denmark. So in 1979, less than 50% indicated that other people can be trusted, and yeah, in the 2010s, it's between 75 and 80%. So as a comparison, in the United Kingdom, the level will be somewhere around 40–45%, which is actually relatively high on a global scale. But just to say that there's clearly sort of a very complex pattern going on here. If you just looked at the Danish development, you might actually be tempted to conclude that trust has actually increased with higher immigration. It's true that it has increased with higher immigration, but it's probably not due to immigration. And that's what I will be showing you here. So in this, again, this is sort of an early analysis. We basically looked at the ethnic diversity or the ethnic composition of Danish municipalities and the level of trust living in those municipalities. And what we found was a relatively strong and clear pattern that with a higher share of non-Western immigrants, there is, on average, lower trust in municipalities, indicating that there is this negative relationship that Putnam also found in the United States. So, some would say perhaps a bit confusingly, while we in the aggregate see what is essentially a positive relationship, then when we look at this across municipalities, so within Denmark, we actually observe the negative relationship that Putnam predicted. So perhaps at this point you say, and that will be a fair criticism, well, you look at municipalities, they are relatively aggregate containers. So a municipality can be 30,000 people, it can sometimes be several 100,000 people in the case of Denmark. So they might not actually capture very well these types of interactions between ethnic groups that we're talking about. So they're essentially poor and very noisy measures of people's actual experiences of ethnic outgroups. So we'll put it in a different way. It's basically possible that there's segregation within these municipalities that, even though something that on the surface looked like an ethnically heterogeneous municipality, then it might actually be within that municipality, people segregate and live in very homogeneous, more local localities, essentially. So what we want to do is basically we want to measure the local context much more locally, or in a much more in the much more immediate radius of where people are residing, in order basically to get a measure that is more credible of what people is actually exposed to over time. And to do that, my co-author and I adopted a micro-contextual approach. It is one of the examples of social science on easy mode. Or at least it tries to utilize the Danish registries in this regard. And what we did using this approach, we basically took a number of surveys that contained questions about trust. And then via anonymized social security numbers, we were able to link that to the registries in Denmark, which are population registries with a wealth of information about ethnicity, and very importantly here, about geographical location where people live. We don't know exactly where in the country they live, but we know where they live in relation to each other. And also other socio-demographic characteristics. So with that information, we were basically able to determine the ethnic composition of what we call micro-contexts. It's also sometimes called ego-hoods. So basically a local or personal neighborhood taking you as point of departure, and basically that context of any given size, of a radius of any given size. So that we basically go down to a radius of 80 meters, and then we zoom out to see if that changes, and I'll show you in a second what that entails for the result. But we argue that this is basically a way of enabling a quite strong test of the inter-ethnic exposure argument that when you measure it at a very local distance, you are basically picking up some exposure, and that you would not do if, for example, if you look at it over across municipalities, which is a much more aggregate measure. What we find, I think, interestingly, is that when we measure or when we look at the relationship very locally, within actually down to 80 meters or just a couple of 100 meters, we do see a weak negative relationship indicating that where there's more immigrants living, natives tend to on average be slightly less trusting. When we zoom out, even just to, let's say, around a radius of 2 kilometers, which is still quite locally, the effect or the relationship basically disappears or it goes towards zero, and the standard errors also increase, indicating that it becomes a quite noisy measure. We basically observe no relationship when we zoom out only to the 2,500 meter radius, which is still quite locally. So to us, that indicates that in order to potentially capture this effect, we need to focus very locally on where people would be over time exposed to outgroups. And if we do that, we do actually uncover, again, a weak negative relationship between ethnic diversity or immigration and social trust. So maybe at this point you're thinking, well, okay, maybe I buy that you see the negative relationship between exposure, or where people living, and trust, but actually what you're measuring or what you're picking up is just superficial, fleeting exposure. It doesn't actually measure contact, and that's an important criticism because the literature has been very one-eyed in only focusing on this type of exposure by studying especially residential settings, which are not necessarily very conducive to, let's say, meaningful contact. And when we're talking about contact, we always go back to Allport, who made this very influential formulation back in '54, where he basically said that under the right circumstances, when interactions take a certain form, when they happen continuously, when they are personalized, when they're meaningful in nature, like under those circumstances, interactions can turn into real contact, which is then, in his theory, expected to reduce prejudice towards outgroups. But sort of an extended version of contact theory could predict that that type of contact could extend the we that we are applying, and therefore also increase trust in other people. So in order to test whether contact theory is actually operating or can potentially offer something vis-a-vis explaining trust, we need to find a setting where we can meaningfully test it. And we argue that the workplace is a good setting for that. Because in the workplace, first of all, it's a quite salient extra residential context in the sense that it's probably one of the places where people spend the most time, apart from where they live. There's also a number of features of the workplace context which is likely to work as facilitating conditions for actual contact. So people tend to interact with others on a continuous basis. Oftentimes the contact will be collaborative, so you might work together with people of a different ethnic background. And it can or cannot be between members of different groups of different equal status. There's quite some evidence indicating that when we look at the original claim regarding how we look at outgroups, that there is actually this contact effect in the workplace setting. We can also observe in our data that people are more likely to have immigrant friends from the workplace than they are from the residential setting. So these things are basically indicating that, whereas the residential setting is probably something that's likely to maybe give rise to these quite superficial encounters, you just observe the outgroup, the workplace is a setting where you might actually have real contact, ultimately perhaps friendship, form a friendship with them. Nevertheless, what we observe across workplaces in Denmark is that the more ethnically diverse or with a higher concentration of immigrants, we do also see lower levels of trust. So we basically observe the same relationship in the workplace setting as we do in the residential setting. One criticism of this would be saying, yes, true, but not all workplaces are the same. There's a big difference between working, let's say, in manufacturing, where you don't really talk to others, which is actually one of the facilitating conditions, as compared to working in an office where you're working closely together with other people, for example. I buy that 100%, but even when we break it down by sectors, we basically observe the same relationship. There's not really any systematic variation across. Another potential criticism would be, well, okay, but maybe you're just picking up the same as in the residential context. So you're just, in a sense, showing the same thing that you already showed us with the micro context. So maybe you just can't sort of differentiate between the two. So to address that, we basically also include the neighborhood controls. So we also control for where people live and the ethnic composition of those neighborhoods. We also try to include a municipality fixed effect, so basically holding constant municipality we're looking at. And the result is basically robust to both of these. So it does indicate that we're picking up something different, something that's more sort of uniquely tied to the workplace context here. Then you might say, well, okay, maybe fair enough, but this is only cross-sectional data, as is a lot of this type of work, but nevertheless, there could be tons of other potential explanations for this. Very true. However, we also find the same result in a very small panel we have, but nevertheless, we find the same significant negative relationship in panel data where we can hold everything constant. We can hold any sort of things that do not change within individuals constant. And so that could be something like personality traits or early life experiences to sort of weed out or to rule out that could be the potential explanation for the observed relationship. And again, we see the same, we see the same negative relationship. So it's relatively robust in this regard. One question that this leads to is the context that you showed us special? So you've looked a lot of, you focused on Denmark, partly due to the data, due to my knowledge of the context. And what I find is basically a moderate, or I should say a weak negative relationship between ethnic diversity or concentration of immigrants in various social settings, although not importantly in schools. There we don't actually observe any relationship. But we observed a weak negative relationship between immigration, concentration, and social trust. So one interpretation might then be, okay, maybe trust could have been slightly higher in Denmark had there been less immigration. At the same time, this should be seen in the context of Denmark actually being the highest trust country in the world, with trust levels around 80%. So from that, obviously, these sort of abysmal claims about the consequences of immigration are obviously exaggerated. But of course, as I was saying before, the question is this just basically idiosyncratic features of the Danish context we're picking up? One way of addressing that, and I'll finish with this, is looking at how this generalized across studies, and you can do that using a meta-analysis. So basically, at the time of us writing the meta-analysis, we try to locate all studies that have been conducted of the residential context. We found 87 of those with more than 1,000 coefficients, so 1,000 estimates of the relationship. And this is a plot basically showing the results from all of these studies, or the meta, so this is like sort of the aggregate result from each studies. And then pulling across these, we find a weak negative relationship in the aggregate. As you can see, most of the estimates are negative, indicating that there is this negative relationship that I've been talking about, including some of our own studies. And overall, this is sort of the so-called meta-estimate, indicating that pulling across all these studies, there is this weak negative relationship. So it seems to be the case that this is not only something that applies to Denmark, but also something that extends more broadly across contexts. Although, of course, there are also a number of studies actually finding positive relationship. But the vast majority are finding a negative relationship, and also in quite a few cases, those are significant results. Interestingly, I think when we look at variations across studies and whether they study this more locally, as the study I showed you before, or they zoom out to sort of municipalities or regions, we actually see that the strongest effects emerge in more local contexts, indicating again that this sort of actual exposure to people in those contexts might be one of the primary sort of mechanisms driving the negative relationship. When we're zooming out, it becomes much more difficult to say what is this actually a measure of. Right. And then we try to sort of, across all these studies, we collect the data on what did they actually do, what did they control for, et cetera, et cetera. Long story short, basically we observe the same negative relationship, in some cases weaker. For example, if we take into account whether people who actually have minority status themselves were surveyed, so it could be basically a compositional effect. We do see the effect being reduced by a bit, but overall we do see the same sort of negative, weak relationship between share of immigrants or ethnic diversity and trust. Okay, so in conclusion, I've been asking the following question: does immigration and the ethnic diversity that follows from that erode social trust? The answer is a conditional, but a very conditional yes. So I do find that immigrants largely actually catch up to the native population in the country that they migrated to. So there's very little evidence for that channel. The native population, on the other hand, loses trust a little bit when being in proximity to immigrants. However, the effect is quite weak. Some would even say tiny. And as the Danish case also clearly suggests, there are other forces that are much more important for trust. And that's, of course, the reason why the level of trust in Denmark has been driven to historically high levels, despite the fact that we also had increased immigration over this period of time that we're looking at. And that's, I think, seeing those two things together is really important. When you talk to journalists or politicians, they always like, only one part of this. Either they want to, highlight the negative effect, or they want to highlight the trust has increased. But the right balance is important to strike in this regard. So yes, there might be weak negative effects, but overall, there's very little indicating, at least in the Danish case, that trust should be threatened by immigration. Again, also seen from the perspective that trust is at the highest level we've ever recorded, basically. So I would say, at least with our current knowledge, there's no clear indication that trust is fundamentally threatened by immigration, even though there might be these weak negative effects that I've been talking about. So with that, thanks a lot for your attention, and I look forward to hearing your questions.
Peter, thank you very much for this very interesting talk, and I hope that we'll also have sort of questions in the audience, sort of probing Peter on his work. Peter asked me to turn it immediately over to the audience because you've been listening all this time. We're just going to give you a chance to really interact here. Fergus has a mic. I have a mic. So I would say, if you have a question, raise your hand. I'll try to keep a list. We can start up there, and then we'll probably sort of first stay a little bit up in that upper quarter and then slowly move down.
Yes, my name is Jan Maat. I'm actually a colleague of Peter, but I'm working at the Institute of Education here at the UCL. Thank you, Peter. This was really a very enlightening talk, and I really liked the very focused contribution you gave on the relation between diversity or immigration and trust. And something that is bugging me and probably you as well, and you pointed at it in your presentation, is that you said, at least within societies. I remember that from one of your slides. So, which of course points to the fact of how is trust understood when you read such a question, right? Across the different countries. And could it be the case that it has much more positive connotations in the Scandinavian countries, for instance, even that there's some kind of social pressure to answer in the positive? Whereas in other countries, and I'm thinking here particularly of France, actually, because I know the aggregate figures on trust, right? And France always comes out as very low, like 20% or something, in terms of saying most people can be trusted. Whereas in, yeah, as you point out yourself, Denmark, Sweden and Norway, it's usually 60% or higher. And so, yeah, and basically you more or less find support for that idea of maybe that's understood differently, and that immigrants are socialized into different cultural environments with different, say, cultural connotations attached to trust, because you see that the immigrants are so well adapting to the native population. So, yeah, and whereas in Scandinavia it may be associated with something like, well, basically you just have to say that you trust others, otherwise you're a social pariah. When in France it's the opposite. If you say that you trust other people, you're being considered as naive and easy to deceive, and so there's so that carries some kind of negative connotations there. Could be, at least. So do you have, okay, long intro, but do you have any kind of, well, did you do any research into that it might have different connotations, the concept of generalized social trust?
That's a great question, Graham. Thank you. Yeah, that is really, I think, in many ways, sort of the next logical question to answer within this literature. I'm actually currently, together with Kim, rolling out a survey where we're repeating the experiment in 20 different countries in order to address exactly that question. At least the results from the US are the same as in Denmark. So we find this small gap, you know, when we ask the more precise question, but it seems like the misunderstanding level is basically the same. So that indicates that maybe across countries you're actually, you know, the trust question indexes something meaningful, even though that in sort of in absolute terms it might exaggerate it a little bit. Your second point, I think, yeah, I mean, it's also a great one. I've done some very simple analyses, I would say, like looking at, for example, the correlative trust of different ethnic groups to say, you know, that's one way of indicating, like let's say it doesn't correlate at all with life satisfaction for one group and it correlates very strongly. And, you know, basically find sort of a very, very similar pattern across groups as well as for natives. By far, like certainly not sort of definitive evidence in that regard. I think also more broadly to your point, you know, I think the social pressure point is a difficult one to assess. I mean, I guess, of course, the question is that, does that then only apply to the survey, or does it also apply to how people actually act? You know, if they like sort of, they feel compelled or forced to also act in a trusting way, then, you know, they're imitating trusters in a good way, you could say. But that is, of course, the question. Is it sort of a social desirability aspect? I'm not sure how big I would think that is in sort of a survey setting where people are filling this out anonymously online. But I agree with you, it's difficult to adjudicate altogether with the current surveys we have at hand. But yeah.
Thank you. Do we have another question maybe from the upper quarter so that Fergus doesn't need to run around? No? No? Okay, do we have a question from the lower side here? Any hands here? Yeah, okay, then first there.
Hi, thank you very much. That was really interesting. It was more of a two-finger about whether you have evidence about how natives and migrants might understand the question differently, especially people that come from more diverse societies or societies in which there are different kinds of divisions that might kind of come to mind when asking this generalized trust question.
Right. I mean, again, I only have, I would say, partial evidence. So I did, a long time ago, I did a survey where the questions were translated into the languages of different immigrant groups. And there the levels were close to similar to those that were interviewed in Danish, basically. So it didn't seem to sort of be confounded by language, which is actually something that some people have, you know, saying that, for example, in French, there's not the equivalent of trust in the Germanic languages. There's only confiance, or, you know, the equivalent in other Romance languages. So maybe that doesn't imply the same. I actually have another study trying to sort of filter that out, where you sort of have people who speak multiple languages and you try to ask them in a different language to see whether they tend to give more trusting answers, basically. So it'll sort of, again, be a partial. I think I've done something to address this. I would say also, you know, and I think these are completely fair questions, but to some extent they're also super general for cross-cultural survey research in general, right? So it's something that you basically have to deal with when you're, and you know, maybe one defense at least, sort of, you know, I think at least in the Danish context, I think like the equivalence aspect that people would understand the same about the question, I probably have relatively high trust in that. But of course, you're right. Like when we sort of do the cross-national comparison, then it becomes more complicated. And when immigrants are coming from other countries, you know, yeah, that opens up the question for that. So I think we have some evidence indicating that at least it's sort of, yeah, at least to some extent understood in a similar way, but not in a definitive way, definitely. That's a good point. Maybe there was some.
Hi, thank you. That was a lovely lecture, Peter. I'm going to ask the question, being a very trusting Norwegian living in this country, and I've always, and who asks this trust question in every survey that I do. And the first time I saw that question, I thought this is a horrible question, and then I keep asking it. And in part, because I didn't know what I would respond to that question. If I'm asked that question, doing a survey in Norway, I, like most Norwegians, will say, yes, of course I trust other people. If I'm asked here, I might not say that, right? So I guess I'm, you know, so my big question is this a good question? And I have some sort of sub-questions, having, you know, thought about this also in my own work. So who is it people imagine in this question? Have you done work on that? Have people done work on that? Like, who is it that you're actually, you know,
right,
you know, imagining? And then I've also thought, like, why are we asking this question when we don't even know who people are imagining? Why aren't we just asking about local trust, neighborhood trust, which we also think are going to affect all these other outcomes that we care about, why we studied this to begin with? And then, and the sort of final, I mean, I have a long list of questions, but a final one to ask is that, are all immigrants the same, right, when in these analyses? And probably you've gotten at that in the micro-analysis that you're doing, but that also seems to be something that could shape this.
Exactly. Great questions, Kristen. Thank you. Yeah, so we have, like, maybe start from the back. We did try to sort of break, let's say, the composition down by, you know, let's say, what is sometimes called non-Western countries, or, you know, majority Muslim countries, for example, or Western countries. And it does seem to be sort of those that are classified as non-Western in the Danish context, at least, seem to have a stronger, like, negative relationship with trust. Probably because they're perceived as more different, I imagine. But there's not really enough statistical power to sort of pass that out 100%. So also because, you know, in most settings, yeah, there's a quite strong correlation. So we could also not look, for example, only at, let's say, one specific immigrant group. So it tends to be, I think in a place like London, you can actually do that, but it's only very few countries or very few settings like London, New York, etc., where you could probably do that credibly, actually trying to pass out, which also relates to another question. So is it just concentration of immigrants per se, or is it specifically heterogeneity, you know, different groups, right? And, you know, the reality is just empirically, it's almost impossible to do because they're very highly correlated, at least in the settings that I've had data for. On your trust question, or actually the first question you asked, so this is what we tried to do in the experiment, where we sort of said, okay, we have the classical question. I'm actually of the opposite. I guess, like, in opinion, I'm probably a bit motivated, I could imagine, but, you know, than you, in the sense that I think it's incredible to think about this question having been asked in 1948 for the first time, and it's still relatively fresh. I mean, have you ever looked at these questions from the 70s? I mean, like, they sound crazy when you hear them today, because, like, they're about something that's, you know, that's not relevant at all. And I actually think this works quite well for that. It's not perfect, I agree. But when we give them, I think, a more precise question where we're saying we're specifically thinking about other people, then again, it's slightly lower, but it's very highly correlated 2 weeks after with the other measures. So I think it indexes the right thing, so to speak. It's also correlated with actual behavior in a trust game, for example. So there are some sort of validity checks that have been done, and they do seem to indicate that it, or maybe sort of a compromise with saying, yeah, I do think it taps into it, not in a very clean way, but I think in a way that's actually meaningful. The last question was, yeah, the local trust. Yeah, no, that's no. I think it's very interesting to look at local trust. I just have an affinity for this type of trust, but, you know, there's nothing wrong with studying that, and there's also quite a lot of studies on that per se. I mean, I probably think that local trust is basically what rubs off on your trust in other people in general. But I don't have sort of there is some indication of that, not my own work, but others indicating that as well. You know, again, coming from the idea that you sort of, the experiences you have there influences how you think about other people, and then that sort of generalizes to other people in general.
Okay, we have around 5 more minutes. Maybe we can squeeze in a couple of questions. No sub-questions allowed, though, anymore. Please, down there.
Hi. So what you've explained over here, it's on a quantitative basis, it's really interesting. But what are you going to do with this information? Is there anything that you can do in terms of creating a solution, maybe improving social trust and social cohesion?
I mean, I think that's a great question, and in many ways the obvious question, right? And to be completely frank, I would love to sort of be able to develop an intervention of some sort, and I think hopefully I will try to do that eventually.
Because otherwise, what's the purpose? So if you,
I mean, what's the purpose? I think the purpose is to sort of address this issue or the potential challenge, and I think like addressing that, and I think also finding out how big the potential challenge is, right? So you could have, at least based on some of the initial studies, saying that this is sort of a threat to social cohesion of society in general, and I'm basically saying, well, that's a pretty wild exaggeration. It might have had like small negative consequences, but they're there. But I prefer sort of understanding, what I think is the reality of things, and then sort of addressing those instead of sort of not knowing it, and that could also sort of lead to, let's say, misperceptions of how things are in reality. So I would say we need to sort of understand that before we can potentially address it. Find out whether there is actually anything to address, in a sense, if that makes sense.
have you discovered what the different factors are where there's better cohesion in some countries and less in others?
Right. So basically, what I didn't talk about here because there wasn't time, so I think the second part of the book will basically be showing, which is sort of the other part of my trust agenda, which shows that I talked about a little bit, is about basically indicating the institutional quality is the main driver. So I think the main reason why Denmark and Norway and all the other Nordic countries are the most trusting countries in the world is because they have very low corruption. And that's an indication of quality of government and I would say fairness, institutional fairness more broadly. And that has, I think, a lot of positive consequences, both for the natives, but also for the immigrants migrating there, basically. And to some extent, what we see is probably that my interpretation, we're going to have not super direct evidence on this, but partly we can address this. It indicates that, institutional perceptions of institutional quality also is quite strongly predictive of social trust.
So does that mean that France is very corrupt? Where they have a really low...
I don't want to be the judge of France.
Peter, you want to keep your job, right?
Yeah, exactly. No, France is great. No, but trust into the state is very low in France, as you might know. And that is probably, I think, one reason why social trust or trust in other people is also low. So basically, I think there's sort of a state-centered solution, if you will, that the weak negative consequences of ethnic diversity can probably be overruled or overridden if we just could try to sort of just combat corruption, but that's not super simple to do in the first place, of course. But I'm just saying, for me, the solution lies in basically developing better institutions that are the ones basically guarding the interactions we have with other people. So if they are more positive or more benign, I think that's the root of essentially creating higher trust and also many other good things, of course, and the positive beneficial consequences that flow from that.
Okay, thank you very much.
Do you have any questions from maybe this quarter down here or the upper quarter, sort of on this side of the room? No? Then I see Rod. And then after Rod, we have time for one last question.
So really, really interesting talk. I guess I'm just going to push you a little bit on where you think this distrust comes from. And I'm wondering to what extent you could identify, let's say, either kind of economic threats or cultural threats. So even if you have a well-behaved government, how do I know that these people aren't coming to take my jobs or to get rid of my local church next door and turn it into a mosque or something like that?
Right. So I think my perspective is that what you describe is probably conditions that could sort of magnify or amplify the negative consequences of ethnic diversity. To what extent they're present in the context I probably vary, and I cannot sort of determine that exactly. One way of looking at that is like, does this effect vary with you know, how precariously you're employed, or, you know, are you unemployed, or, you know, what is your social situation in general. We don't actually find any different effects across those. But as a general matter, I agree with you. I think it's likely that certain people would potentially feel more threatened by this. We also know that from related literatures looking at outgroup attitudes, for example. So I think that's true. I think the expectation we have is a bit more neutral. It's basically just observing something who's different, that you identify as different than. And then I think what you're mentioning are likely sort of, amplifiers of that potential negative relationship. I think there was one.
One last question in the back.
Thanks for the talk. I was wondering whether you've done any work on how trust changes over time in societies that have become more diverse, but where diversity stabilizes. And I'm thinking in particular that the drops in trust that we see might be a shock reaction to a society becoming more diverse, and then over time, that effect might reverse.
Right. I don't know, this is probably too small for you to be able to see it, but in the book we have more countries, and it's basically just a plethora of relationships, right? This is also just aggregate relationships in any case, right? But you know, in some countries you would see the expected pattern, like in the US it's gone up, and then you see trust going down. In Denmark you see exactly the opposite. So there's not really any sort of very clear pattern in that regard. I'm also probably a bit, I'm skeptical of drawing any inferences from these like aggregate level data in any case, I would say. But of course they are relevant, you know, to contextualize the negative findings I presented from Denmark, because I said, well, you should look at this like in the context of Denmark being the most trusting society in the world, right? So to your question, there are some analyses looking at this, because I think if you measure ethnic diversity or immigration at the national level, then you're also tapping into so many other things. I'm a bit skeptical of that as an approach. I think we need to study it more locally, where we have a better idea of what people are actually experiencing. But of course, sort of in terms of like having these big picture sort of developments, then I do understand your point. And that's basically what we're trying to do with these. But in some sense, we end up concluding we can't really sort of infer much from these, because there's, you know, it's simply too heterogeneous. But extending your question, you know, it's very interesting to look at like, what are, for example, the policies that have been enacted in those? Like, what are the type of immigrants you've received, and so on and so forth. So, I mean, there's a lot of things you could do interestingly that could sort of speak to that question, I think, to some extent at least.
Well, thank you very much, Peter. Thank you very much to the audience for your great questions and the great discussion that we had. I just want to end on two small observations. As you know, research is also always me-search, as they say. One thing that you highlighted is sort of the importance of institutions. And you know, you've only been sort of here for a few months, but that's something that I really noticed is a strong commitment to institutions. You know, the way you have engaged here in this department, have started to build up sort of institutions. So I just wanted to highlight that. I also wanted to highlight on a very personal note that, you know, I think that having you here in the department is sort of a really great contribution scientifically, but also sort of on a personal level to have here. And so I have strong trust that that you will have a great continued sort of research agenda here at UCL, and I hope that, you know, everyone here at UCL can help you to achieve your goals that you have scientifically and also personally. So thank you for your great talk. Thank you for all your questions, and I think there is now drinks waiting, so I don't want to stand between those and you. So thank you very much.